The bees knew before I did. For weeks after Ruth died, they refused to enter hive number 7. Every other colony on the property hummed with their ancient, purposeful rhythm, moving between the late autumn wildflowers and the sugar water feeders I had set out against the coming frost. But hive 7 sat silent. No workers crawling across the landing board. No faint vibration when I pressed my palm against the cedar. Just stillness, as though the colony had declared the structure a tomb and moved on to cleaner ground. I am Walter Pembroke, 74 years old, beekeeper, maple farmer, and widower of 6 weeks. My hands carry the calluses of 50 years working Vermont soil, and my bones carry the particular ache of a man who buried his wife on a Tuesday morning and has not slept a full night since. Ruth collapsed on our kitchen floor in late September, and the official word was hemorrhagic stroke. Quick, they told me. Painless, they promised. Natural, for a woman her age. I believed them because I had no reason not to. Because the alternative was a darkness too vast for a grieving man to face alone. But the bees would not enter hive 7. And Ruth had always said that bees know things we have forgotten how to hear. It was the first week of November when I finally pulled on my thick canvas gloves and walked out to the apiaries. The morning frost crunched beneath my boots like shattered glass. The green mountains rose behind the farm in their bare November skeleton, stripped of the fiery reds and golds that had covered them just weeks before. The air tasted of wood smoke and frozen earth, carrying the faint sweetness of decomposing leaves that always reminded me of endings. I approached hive 7 with the smoker in one hand and my hive tool in the other. The white-painted box sat at the end of the row, slightly apart from the others, as though even the neighboring colonies wanted distance from whatever secret it held. I puffed smoke across the entrance. Nothing stirred. No defensive hum. No guard bees rising to challenge the intrusion. I pried the outer cover loose, the propolis seal cracking with a sound like old bones popping. Then, the inner cover. Then the first frame. That is when I found it. Wedged between the 7th and 8th frame, wrapped in wax cloth that had been deliberately pressed into the comb by human hands, was a small rectangular device. An old MP3 player, the kind Ruth used to clip to her apron while she worked in the garden, listening to audiobooks about medicinal herbs and pharmaceutical chemistry. The screen was dark, but a tiny blue light pulsed at its edge like a heartbeat that refused to stop. My chest tightened. Ruth had put this here. She had sealed it in wax cloth to protect it from moisture, tucked it into the one place in this world that only I would ever dare open with my bare hands. My wife knew I was the only Pembroke who worked the hives without fear. Graham never came within 30 feet of the apiaries. Ada had been stung too many times as a child. And Emmett, my youngest, had not been home in over 2 years. This device was meant for me. Only for me. I carried it inside with trembling hands, the wax cloth peeling away to reveal the scratched silver surface beneath. The battery indicator showed 14%. 43 files sat in the audio folder, each one titled with Ruth's precise, pharmacist's shorthand. The first was labeled simply, "For Walter. Play alone." How many times in a marriage do you hear your wife's voice and think nothing of it? How many mornings did I sit at this kitchen table while Ruth hummed over the stove, her voice a background melody I took for granted like birdsong or rainfall? Now, standing in that same kitchen with the November wind rattling the window panes, I understood that I would never hear her voice casually again. Every remaining word she had left behind was deliberate. Chosen. Urgent. I pressed play. Static first. Then a breath. Then Ruth's voice. And the sound of it hit me like a physical weight against my sternum. She was calm. Too calm. The clinical steadiness of a woman who had spent 30 years as a licensed pharmacist, measuring doses and calculating half-lives. "Walter," she said. And my name sounded like both a prayer and a warning. "If you are hearing this, the honey from hive 7 is not safe. Our son is poisoning me. Graham has been lacing the honey from that specific hive with brodifacoum. It is a second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide. At the concentration I have detected, it mimics the symptoms of a natural hemorrhagic event. A stroke, Walter. He is manufacturing my stroke. The kitchen walls seem to close in around me. The ticking of the clock above the stove became the loudest sound in the universe. I have not told you, because I am terrified he will come for you next. Graham is not working alone. There is a woman, and there is money involved. Enormous money, the kind that makes sons forget their mothers are human beings. She paused. I heard her swallow. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a woman who understood the exact biochemistry of her own murder and could do nothing to stop it except leave breadcrumbs for the man she loved. 43 recordings, Walter. Everything you need is here. But you must be careful. You must be the beekeeper, not the bear. Patient. Strategic. Do not let grief make you reckless. The file ended. But not before 6 final words that rooted me to the kitchen tile like nails driven through my boots. Check the sugar shack. The propane. They have already started on you. I stood there as the November wind screamed against the farmhouse. 43 recordings. My dead wife's voice. My eldest son's name spoken like a diagnosis of terminal disease. And somewhere on this land, in the sugar shack that had been in my family for 4 generations, someone had already begun preparing my own death. I looked at the MP3 player. 14% battery. 42 files remaining. And a truth growing inside my chest like venom spreading through the blood of a woman who trusted her own son to bring her honey every Sunday morning. I tucked the device deep into my coat and headed for the truck. Burlington was 2 hours north. 43 recordings waited inside that shell of plastic and circuits. And my son's name was written in blood across every single one. The tech shop in Burlington smelled of burnt solder and stale energy drinks. A bell chimed overhead as I pushed through the glass door. The warmth of the cramped interior hitting my face like a wall after 2 hours of driving through November rain. The place was cluttered with the skeletons of dead electronics. Circuit boards pinned to corkboards like insect specimens. Tangled cables hanging from hooks like industrial vines. A hand-painted sign above the register read Milo's Micro Repairs in letters that looked like they had been written by a man who preferred talking to machines over people. Milo Chandler emerged from the back room carrying a soldering iron that trailed a thin ribbon of smoke. He could not have been older than 28. Wire-rimmed glasses sat crooked on his nose, and his fingers were stained with the particular gray-black residue of a man who spent his days resurrecting things other people had given up on. He looked at me the way young people often look at old men who wander into tech shops. Polite confusion. I placed the MP3 player on the counter, the wax cloth still clinging to its edges. I told him the device belonged to my late wife, that I needed the files extracted and backed up before the battery died completely. Simple enough. A grieving widower preserving his wife's audiobooks. That was the story I had prepared. But Milo was not simple. He plugged the device into his diagnostic terminal, his fingers dancing over the keyboard with the unconscious speed of a generation raised on screens. I watched the blue progress bar crawl across his monitor, reflecting in his glasses like a slow-moving tide. For 30 seconds, he said nothing. Then his fingers stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked up at me, then over my shoulder at the empty storefront, then back at the screen. Click! The sound of the deadbolt sliding home made my spine straighten. Milo had locked the front door without leaving his stool. "Sir," he said, his voice dropping to a register I had to lean forward to hear. "These files are not audiobooks. They are high bitrate voice recordings, disguised as system logs, encrypted, time-stamped, and every single timestamp corresponds to a date within the last 3 months of your wife's life." I gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the cold laminate beneath my calloused palms. He continued, explaining that someone with serious technical knowledge had hidden these files behind layers of misdirection. The casual user would see an empty device with a dead music library. But underneath, 43 recordings sat like landmines, waiting for the right pair of hands to unearth them. Your wife hid these on purpose, Milo whispered, his eyes darting toward the locked door. And whoever she was hiding them from, she was terrified of. This is not a diary, Mr. Pembroke. This is evidence. He slid a pair of studio-grade noise-canceling headphones across the counter. Heavy. Professional. The kind that sealed the world out completely. He told me to listen in my truck, not inside the shop, and never inside my own home. If the people on these recordings were still in my life, he said, then my walls might have ears I did not know about. He refused payment. Simply looked at me with those young, frightened eyes, and said one sentence that followed me out into the November rain, like a ghost attached to my shadow. Don't trust your family, sir. Not a single one of them. Not until you have heard the end of that last file. The truck cab was cold. The rain hammered against the windshield in sheets, turning the parking lot into a blur of gray and neon reflections from the shop signs across the street. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, the noise-canceling headphones sealing me inside a private chamber of silence. The vinyl seat creaked beneath my weight. The smell of wet wool and old coffee grounds filled the cab. I pressed play on file 2. Titled The Honey Protocol. Ruth's voice returned. Steadier this time. More clinical. She had recorded this one in the early morning hours. I could tell, because I heard the faint ticking of our bedroom clock in the background and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the valley. She spoke as a pharmacist now, not a wife. She explained that she had taken 3 samples of the honey Graham brought her every Sunday, sealed them in small glass vials, driven them to a private laboratory in Montpelier under a false name. The results confirmed what her body had already been telling her. Brodifacoum. 0.0. 3 milligrams per gram of honey. She calculated that at her daily consumption of 2 tablespoons in her morning tea, she was ingesting roughly 18 times the threshold that would cause irreversible coagulopathy in a woman of her weight. She described the symptoms she had been hiding from me, the deep purple bruising beneath her sleeves, the metallic taste that ruined every meal, the nosebleeds she blamed on dry air, the exhaustion she attributed to age. I hid the lab receipts in the hollow behind the medicine cabinet in our bathroom, she said, and I hid the remaining honey samples in the cold cellar, behind the jars of 1992 maple syrup that no one touches but me. She paused. I heard her breath catch, and for one moment, the clinical mask slipped. I am so sorry I did not tell you, Walter. Every morning I watched you pour my tea and bring it to me with that smile, and I wanted to scream. But Graham watches everything. If you had confronted him, if you had shown even a flicker of suspicion, I believe he would have accelerated the timeline for both of us. The recording shifted then. Her tone dropped lower. Urgent. There is more. The poison is only the first phase. Graham is working with a woman named Victoria Slade. She is not who she claims to be. They have plans for the land, Walter. Plans that require you to be declared incompetent or dead before the first week of December. I do not have all the details yet, but I am recording everything I can. She ended the file with a warning that felt like a cold hand pressing against my chest through the truck's heating vents. Do not go home tonight without checking the sugar shack. The propane valve. I overheard Graham on the phone 2 days ago talking about making something look like an accident. A gas explosion in an old sugar house. The kind of thing that happens to elderly farmers who live alone. Walter, they are not waiting for me to die anymore. They have already started on you. I ripped the headphones off. The rain hammered against the windshield. Indifferent to the war that had just been declared inside my chest, my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the calluses pressing grooves into the leather. How do you reconcile 46 years of love with a voice from the grave telling you that your own child is counting the minutes until your heart stops beating? I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed to life, and the wipers began their frantic slapping against the downpour. The farm was 2 hours south. The sugar shack was waiting, and the woman I had buried 6 weeks ago was still fighting for my life from inside a device that had 14% battery and 41 files remaining. Hold on, Ruth. I am listening. And I am coming home with my eyes open for the first time in months. The farmhouse appeared through the November fog like a skeleton draped in gray. My headlights carved two pale tunnels through the mist, illuminating the frozen gravel and the bare maple branches that clawed at the darkening sky. But as the porch light flickered into view, I realized I was not coming home to an empty house. A figure stood on my front steps, hunched against the cold in a yellow rain slicker that gleamed like a hazard sign under the sputtering bulb. My hand moved toward the glove box before I recognized the silhouette. Carl Pembroke, my 78-year-old cousin who had farmed the adjacent plot since we were both boys pulling sap buckets through these same woods. Carl was not a man given to social calls after dark. Every time he appeared unannounced meant trouble. I stepped out into the freezing mud. Carl's face was drawn tight beneath his hood, his eyes carrying the alertness of a man who had witnessed something that disturbed his understanding of the natural order. "Walter," he said, barely above the dripping of water from the eaves, "you ought to lock your gates. Those men in the black vehicle were not here for any maple survey." The metallic taste of adrenaline bloomed against the roof of my mouth as Carl explained what he had seen while I was in Burlington. A black SUV, with out-of-state plates, had crawled up the Eastern Fire Road. Two men in hard hats spent nearly an hour walking my eastern 50 acres with handheld instruments, taking soil samples and photographing the tree line. Carl had watched through his binoculars, something in their movements, triggering the instinct of a man who knew this land like his own heartbeat. But that was not the worst of it. Carl leaned closer, his breath a visible cloud between us. "Your boy was here too." Graham let himself in with a key I did not know he had. Stayed 40 minutes. Left in a hurry when those men pulled up the fire road. He produced a damp envelope from his slicker pocket. Found it stuffed deep in my mailbox beneath the regular post. The return address bore a logo I did not recognize. Granite Peak Energy Solutions. Addressed to Graham Pembroke, care of my farm address. I thanked Carl and watched his taillights vanish into the fog before turning toward the back trail. The sugar shack came first. Ruth's warning was a siren growing louder with every step. The path wound through the maple grove, bare branches forming a lattice of black against the gray sky. My boots knew this trail by memory. 50 years of walking between house and sugar shack during sugaring season, carrying buckets, stoking the evaporator, breathing the sweet steam. Tonight, it felt like walking into a tomb. The sugar shack appeared as a dark rectangle against the tree line. I pulled the heavy door open, and the smell hit me before I crossed the threshold. Propane. Thick, nauseating, unmistakable. The rotten egg odor of mercaptan so concentrated that my eyes burned and my lungs refused a full breath. This was no leak. This was deliberate. I covered my mouth and moved fast. Years of working gas-fired evaporators gave me the muscle memory to find the main valve in darkness. My fingers closed around the cold brass handle and twisted it shut. The hiss died. But the silence was worse, because in that silence, I saw what they had done. A linen dish towel, one of Ruth's with the embroidered bluebirds she stitched during her first winter here, had been draped over the pilot light housing of the backup heater. Not close enough to ignite immediately, but close enough that a single spark from the pilot cycling on during the cold night would have turned this structure into a fireball. An old sugar shack. An old farmer who wandered out to check on things. A tragic accident. The kind that makes the local paper for one day and disappears into the category of things that happen to elderly men who live alone in the mountains. I snatched the towel away with shaking hands and kicked open the back window. The freezing air rushed in, displacing the poison with clean mountain cold. As the gas cleared, I crouched and swept my flashlight across the floorboards. There, in the fine layer of sawdust and dried maple residue, I found them. Boot prints. Fresh. Smooth-soled. Expensive. The kind of shoes a man who works in office buildings wears when he visits a farm he intends to never work. I had seen those soles 2 weeks ago. Italian leather, with a distinctive chevron tread. Graham's shoes. Sitting by my front door during his last visit. My own son had walked into this sugar shack, opened the propane valve, draped his dead mother's dish towel over the pilot housing, and walked out expecting never to return. How many mornings did I carry that boy through this grove on my shoulders? How many times did I teach him to tap a maple, to read the sap flow, to know when the sugar was perfect by the way syrup sheeted off a spoon? Those same hands I trained to hold a tapping spade had turned my propane line into a crematorium. You want me dead before the first snow, Graham? I whispered to the cold air, my breath rising between the bare branches. You will have to try harder than your father's propane line, because I am not the confused old man you buried with your mother. I am the beekeeper. And bees do not forget who raided their hive. I locked the sugar shack with a new combination and walked back toward the house. The granite peak envelope sat heavy in my pocket beside the MP3 player. 2 pieces of a growing darkness. Tomorrow, the wolves would come bearing gifts. I needed to look them in the eye and make them believe the sheep was already dead. The crunch of luxury tires on frozen gravel woke me at 7. I had not slept. The kitchen smelled of cold coffee and the faint ghost of propane that still clung to my coat from the night before. I had spent the hours between midnight and dawn sitting at the oak table, staring at the granite peak envelope without opening it, letting the weight of what I already knew settle into my bones like winter frost seeping into old timber. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the black SUV glide up the driveway like a hearse arriving for a scheduled appointment. Behind it, a silver sedan I did not recognize. 2 vehicles. 2 predators. And whatever they carried in their manicured hands was not meant to heal. Graham emerged first. My eldest son, 46 years old, broad-shouldered in a cashmere overcoat that cost more than my monthly heating bill. He carried a pink bakery box from that artisan place in Montpelier, the one that charges $9 for a single maple scone. His face wore the expression I had come to recognize as his concerned sun mask. Furrowed brow, soft eyes, slight tilt of the head. A performance so polished it could have fooled anyone who had not spent the previous night listening to his dead mother describe the exact mechanism of her own murder. The woman stepped out of the silver sedan with the precision of a blade being unsheathed. Victoria Slade, 41. I had met her twice before at family gatherings, where Graham introduced her as his financial consultant. She was tall, angular, dressed in charcoal wool that fit her frame like armor. Her eyes were the color of frozen amber, and they swept the farmhouse exterior with the appraising hunger of a real estate developer calculating demolition costs. I shuffled to the door, letting my shoulders curve inward, my gaze drift slightly out of focus. The performance had begun. Dad. Graham's voice dripped with a sweetness that made my throat tighten. We brought you breakfast. Those maple scones you love. He set the box on the counter with a thud that echoed through the silent kitchen. His eyes immediately scanned the room, moving across shelves, countertops, the windowsill above the sink. He was looking for the MP3 player. I could see it in the way his gaze lingered on flat surfaces, searching for that familiar scratched silver shape. Victoria entered behind him, her perfume preceding her like a chemical announcement. Something expensive and sharp that fought with the honest kitchen, smells of wood smoke and cold coffee. She smiled at me, but the smile stopped at her cheekbones, never reaching those calculating amber eyes. Good morning, Walter, she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. You smell a bit like propane, dear. Are you sure the heating is working properly? I watched her nostrils flare slightly as she catalogued the residual gas scent on my flannel shirt. Was she checking? Confirming that the sugar shack had done its work? I let my mouth hang slightly open, blinking as though the question confused me. Propane? I mumbled, scratching at the stubble on my jaw. I think I checked the lines yesterday. Or was that Tuesday? The days run together since Ruth. Graham and Victoria exchanged a glance. Quick. Satisfied. The confused old man was performing exactly as expected. Victoria reached into her leather briefcase and produced a glossy brochure. The cover showed a sunlit courtyard, surrounded by smiling gray-haired people in matching cardigans. Pinewood Haven Memory Care and Wellness Center. The words hit me like a punch wrapped in silk. Tane. We have been talking, Victoria began, then caught herself. Walter. Forgive me. We have been talking about your safety. Graham has noticed some concerning patterns. The stove left on. Wandering at night. And now the propane. It is simply not safe for you to be alone here anymore. Graham nodded, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the morning chill. Dad, we already paid the deposit. Pinewood has a top-tier unit. You would have round-the-clock care. It is what Mom would have wanted. What your mother would have wanted was to not be poisoned by her own firstborn. But I swallowed that truth, like broken glass, and kept my face slack. They spoke for 20 minutes. I tracked every word, while maintaining the foggy stare of a man losing his grip on the present tense. Victoria described Pinewood's amenities with the rehearsed enthusiasm of a timeshare salesperson. Medication management, structured activities, secured perimeters. She was describing my prison cell and calling it paradise. Then they made their mistake. Believing I had already faded into the wallpaper, they began speaking to each other in lowered voices. Graham mentioned a state permit deadline. Victoria whispered about the mineral lease needing power of attorney signed before Friday. Graham insisted they needed the paperwork today. Victoria reminded him that the Granite Peak team was already staged 12 miles east, waiting for the legal gates to open. He is too tired to fight us, Graham, Victoria murmured, her voice stripped of its artificial warmth. Just look at him. I sat motionless, cataloging every syllable, every deadline, every dollar sign I could read between their whispered lines. As they prepared to leave, Graham made a show of tidying the kitchen, but I watched his hand dip into the ceramic bowl by the door. The faint rattle of my Sugar Shack key disappearing into his coat pocket confirmed what the boot prints had already told me. Rest up, Dad, he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt like a slab of cold meat. We will see you tomorrow. The moment their vehicles crunched over the frozen driveway and vanished into the morning fog, I straightened my spine. The vacant stare evaporated. I moved with the focused urgency of a man whose countdown clock had just become visible. I checked the desk drawer first. My passport. Gone. The old broken MP3 player I had deliberately left on the bookshelf as a decoy, the one with a cracked screen and dead battery that looked enough like Ruth's device to fool someone searching in haste, also gone. They had taken the bait, snatched the shiny glass decoy, and never thought to look behind the honey extractor in the basement, where the real device sat taped to the cold metal housing, hidden in the one place that smelled of beeswax and required a beekeeper's courage to reach into the dark. I retrieved it with steady hands. 14% battery had become 11. But 41 files still waited, patient as seeds beneath winter soil. They took the bait and missed the sting, I whispered, pressing the cold device against my chest. I still have you, Ruth, and I am just getting started. The basement workshop smelled of beeswax and old cedar, the honest scent of a room where hands build things rather than destroy them. I descended the stairs with the MP3 player clutched against my chest, each step creaking beneath my weight like a confession I was not ready to make. Down here, the walls were poured concrete, and the ceiling was insulated with layers of fiberglass that turned the space into a vault of silence. If Graham had planted listening devices in the house above, they would hear nothing from this depth but the muffled heartbeat of the furnace. I sat at my workbench, the rough cedar surface scarred by decades of repairs, honey frame assemblies, and the quiet, meditative work of a man who needed his hands busy to keep his mind still. The single fluorescent tube overhead flickered with a dying rhythm, casting jittery shadows across my tools. I plugged the MP3 player into an old charging cable, watching the battery icon pulse from 11% to 12. Slow, but alive. I selected File 3. Ruth had titled it, The Orchard Conversation. The audio opened with a quality that surprised me. Clear. Close. She must have left the device in something portable, perhaps the garden basket she always carried when collecting herbs near the tree line. The background held the unmistakable sound of boots on frozen leaves and the distant mechanical hum of the property's well pump. Graham's voice came first. Low. Conspiratorial. The tone of a man who believed he was speaking in a cathedral of privacy beneath open sky. The mineral survey came back better than projected, he said. The lithium deposits extend across the entire eastern parcel. 42 million. Victoria. That is the floor estimate. Victoria's response was sharp as a blade drawn across glass. The auction is in 5 days. The state requires the landowner's signature or a legal power of attorney to file the extraction permit. Your father's name is on that deed, Graham. Not yours, which is why Pinewood solves everything. Once he is admitted, and the cognitive assessment confirms what we have documented, the court grants emergency guardianship within 72 hours. I have already filed the preliminary petition. I pressed my palm flat against the workbench, feeling the grain bite into my skin. My own son had filed court documents to strip me of my autonomy, and I had not known. How many evenings had he sat at my kitchen table, eating my food, while the paperwork to erase my legal existence was already moving through the system? The recording continued. Victoria mentioned that the environmental review had been quietly shelved by a contact at the state agency. Graham laughed, a sound that made my stomach lurch, and said their financial advisor had already structured the shell companies to receive the lease payments. Then a third voice entered the conversation. Arthur Vance, 60 years old. My financial advisor for 28 years. The man who managed every harvest payment, every maple syrup contract, every retirement account Ruth and I had built together. His voice was dry, clinical, carrying the particular authority of a man who understood the architecture of wealth better than the people who earned it. The trust restructuring is complete, Arthur said. Once guardianship is granted, the farm transfers into the holding company automatically. Walter never sees the paperwork. By the time the extraction begins, his name will not appear on a single document. The MP3 player nearly slipped from my fingers. Not you too, Arthur. Not after everything we built together. But grief is a luxury I could not afford. I pressed play on file 4. This recording was different. A phone call. The audio was thinner, captured from a greater distance. But Ruth's microphone had caught enough. Victoria's voice came through with a metallic edge, speaking to someone whose name made every hair on my arms stand rigid. Diane, I need him under heavy sedation from the moment the gates close. The kind of agitation he will show when he realizes he cannot leave will justify anything we administer. The woman on the other end of the line had a voice like silk rubbing against sandpaper. Practiced. Professional. Greedy. For 8% of the mineral lease, Diane replied. Her words measured with the precision of a woman who had negotiated such arrangements before. I will ensure he does not remember his own bees, let alone a property deed. We have protocols for resistant patients. Chemical compliance is standard for his profile. Victoria confirmed the admission date. Monday. She mentioned the first bridge loan payment was due the following Thursday. She needed me medically incapacitated by then to finalize the deed transfer without contest. Diane asked if the sedation needed to be permanent. Victoria paused. The silence on that recording lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like 4 centuries. Let us call it open-ended, Victoria finally said. Men his age have strokes under stress. It is expected. I turned off the device. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like a trapped insect, and the shadows on the concrete wall seemed to lean inward, pressing against me with the weight of what I had just heard. Pinewood Haven was not a care facility. It was a processing center for my disappearance. Diane Farrow was not a nurse. She was an executioner with a prescription pad. And Monday was not an admission date. It was my scheduled death. How much does a human soul weigh when it is being traded for lithium deposits in a Burlington boardroom? I sat in that cold basement, the blue glow of the MP3 player, the only light in the dark, and I calculated. 5 days until the auction, 4 days until they needed me silenced. I had roughly 72 hours of freedom remaining before the chemical fog would claim everything I was and everything Ruth had fought to protect. I closed my eyes and heard Ruth's voice from the first recording, steady as a metronome. You must be the beekeeper, not the bear. Patient. Strategic. Monday was my execution date. But executioners only succeed when the condemned does not know the blade is falling. I knew. And knowing was the first weapon in an arsenal I intended to build before sunrise. Then I heard it. Above my head, the heavy, deliberate tread of boots on the farmhouse floorboards. A vibration that rattled the tools hanging on my pegboard wall. Someone was in my house, and they were heading for the basement door. The basement stairs groaned under Graham's weight like a warning I could not heed. I moved on instinct. The reflexes of a man who has spent decades navigating dark apiaries without disturbing sleeping colonies. 3 steps to the left, behind the tall metal shelving unit that held 50 years of accumulated farm tools, honey supers, and the dusty relics of seasons past. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall, the MP3 player clutched to my chest, and I stopped breathing. Graham did not turn on the overhead light. He preferred the narrow yellow beam of a high-powered flashlight, which told me everything about the nature of this visit. A son checking on his father turns on the light and calls out. A thief uses a flashlight and moves in silence. The beam swept across my workbench, over the charging cables, across the shelves of jarred honey from the past 3 seasons. It lingered on the old radio where I sometimes listened to weather reports, then moved to the floor beneath the bench where I kept empty equipment cases. He was methodical, opening drawers, lifting lids, pushing aside frames and tools with a carelessness that made my jaw clench. These were Ruth's frames, her extraction equipment, her meticulous labels in that steady pharmacist's handwriting. "Where did you put it, you old fool?" he muttered, his voice thick, with a desperation that vibrated in the cold basement air. He was less than 4 feet from where I stood. I could smell his cologne, something sharp and modern that clashed with the honest beeswax scent of my workshop. I could hear the rasp of his breathing. Slightly elevated, slightly panicked. This was not a casual search. Graham knew that Ruth had been recording. He knew the device existed, and he was terrified of what it contained. How do you stand 3 feet from the man who murdered your wife and keep your hands from closing around his throat? You think of Ruth's voice. Patient. Strategic. You think of the 41 files still waiting. You think of Monday. And you remind yourself that revenge served cold is the only dish that arrives with a prison sentence attached. Graham kicked the wooden stool in frustration, the crash echoing off the concrete walls like a gunshot. He swept the flashlight in one final arc, the beam passing within inches of my boots, then turned toward the stairs. Won't matter what he remembers by Tuesday anyway, he muttered as he climbed. The basement door clicked shut. His footsteps crossed the kitchen overhead. And moments later, the front door slammed. The sound of his engine fading down the driveway was the sound of a reprieve I had not earned but intended to weaponize. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer the silence of a victim hiding in his own basement. It was the quiet of a beekeeper who has located the invading wasp and is now calmly planning the defense of his colony. I emerged from behind the shelving unit, my knees protesting after minutes of rigid stillness. I sat at the workbench and opened the drawer where I kept my finest tools, watchmaking instruments inherited from my grandfather, precision screwdrivers, jeweler's loops, and one old hearing aid that had sat unused since I upgraded to a digital model 2 years ago. Over the next hour, I gutted the hearing aid's internal amplifier and replaced it with a high-sensitivity digital microphone wired to a micro SD card. The casing was unchanged. The weight was identical. To anyone looking at my ear, they would see a 74-year-old man with a standard hearing device. But inside, it would capture every whisper, within 15 feet, with studio clarity. Ruth told me to be the beekeeper. A beekeeper's most important tool is not the smoker or the hive tool. It is patience, wrapped in preparation, deployed at exactly the right moment. I waited until the deepest hour of the night before making the 2 calls that would determine whether I survived the week. The first was to Graham. I held the phone in steady hands, but forced my voice to tremble, cracking it at the edges like dry autumn leaves. "Son," I said, letting a long pause stretch between us. "I think I am ready to go to Pinewood now. I do not want to be a burden anymore." Graham's response was immediate. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a laugh he poorly disguised as relief. "That is the right choice, Dad," he said, his voice vibrating with barely contained greed. "Victoria already has the papers ready. We will take you for a tour tomorrow. Just a visit. See how you feel. A visit. The way a spider invites a fly to see the web." I agreed in a whisper, and hung up. The second call was harder. Ada's number rang 4 times before she answered, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of a woman who has already been briefed by her brother on what to expect from her deteriorating father. "Dad, it is late. Is everything all right? Ada, I need you to come to the farm. Tomorrow morning. Just you. No Graham. No Victoria." Silence stretched between us. I could hear the clinical machinery of her mind processing the request, weighing it against whatever narrative Graham had constructed for her. "Dad, Silas sent me some concerning notes," she began, and I caught the slip. She corrected herself quickly. Graham sent me cognitive assessment results. He mentioned episodes with the stove, confusion with dates, wandering at night. He asked me to review them professionally. There it was. My own daughter, a biology teacher with enough scientific literacy to lend medical credibility to Graham's fabrications, had been receiving curated evidence of my supposed decline for weeks. He was building a clinical case using Ada's trust in her brother to legitimize my imprisonment. "Ada," I said, dropping the tremor from my voice, just enough to sound lucid. "I found something of your mother's. Something only you would understand. Something scientific." The word hung between us like a key turning in a lock. I heard her breath catch. The biology teacher in her could not resist a mystery with her mother's fingerprints on it. "Dad, Graham said you were dangerous. Are you?" I closed my eyes. The weight of that question pressed against my chest like a stone. "Come tomorrow, Ada. Bring your science brain. Not your brother's paperwork. I will show you the truth, and then you can decide for yourself whether your father is dangerous or whether he is the only sane person left in this family." Silence. 3 heartbeats. Then her voice, small and uncertain, carrying the ghost of the little girl who used to help me harvest honey on summer mornings. "I will be there, Dad. Tomorrow morning." I hung up and stood in the dark kitchen, the November wind pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. 24 hours. That was all I had to prove I was not the monster Graham had manufactured from forged lab results and convenient lies. Tomorrow, Ada would either become my ally or sign the papers that sealed my coffin. I adjusted the modified hearing aid in my left ear, feeling the slight additional weight of the hidden recorder. Monday was the execution date, but tomorrow was the audition, and I intended to give the performance of a lifetime. The magnetic locks of Pinewood Haven clicked shut behind me with the sound of a jar being sealed. I was the specimen inside. The lobby was designed to smother guilt. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the polished hardwood in a warmth that felt manufactured. The air smelled of lemon disinfectant and fresh-cut lilies, an artificial paradise engineered to convince the families of the living dead that they had made a humane choice. Soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers, the kind of formless melody that fills space without creating memory. Graham stood beside me, his hand on my elbow with the proprietary grip of a man guiding livestock toward a chute. His cashmere coat was unbuttoned now, his collar damp with sweat despite the climate-controlled air. He was nervous, impatient, a man counting minutes until a transaction closed. Diane Farrow emerged from a corridor marked Resident Services with a smile that belonged on a predator studying its reflection. 52 years old, compact, sharp-featured. Her nurse's scrubs were pressed with military precision, and a laminated badge dangled from a lanyard that read Director of Patient Wellness. She extended her hand to me with the patronizing softness one might use on a frightened child. "Welcome to Pinewood, Walter," she cooed. "We are going to take such wonderful care of you here. You are going to love it." I let my handshake go limp. Let my eyes wander to the window, as though I had already forgotten why I was standing there. The hearing aid in my left ear hummed with quiet purpose, its hidden microphone drinking in every sound within a 15-foot radius. Graham leaned toward Diane with the familiarity of co-conspirators who had rehearsed their lines. "He has been having a lot of spells lately," he said, his voice pitched for concern but undercut by urgency. "Confusion. Agitation. We think it is best to start the stabilization protocol immediately upon admission." Diane nodded with practiced gravity. "Of course. We have extensive experience with resistant transitions. Our pharmacological approach ensures comfort and safety during the adjustment period." Comfort. Safety. Adjustment. The vocabulary of captivity dressed in the silk of healthcare. She led us through the locked memory wing. The corridor was white, bright, humming with the low mechanical breath of industrial ventilation. I shuffled beside Graham, maintaining my performance. But my eyes were recording everything. The keypad codes, the camera positions, the medication cart parked outside room 14 with its rows of labeled cups. As we passed the on-site pharmacy, I caught a glimpse through the dispensing window that made my blood congeal. A preparation order clipped to the board bore my name, Walter Pembroke. The medication listed was not a sedative. It was a compound I recognized from Ruth's recordings. The same chemical architecture that had dissolved my wife's vascular system over 3 months of Sunday honey deliveries. They were not planning to sedate me into silence. They were planning to replicate Ruth's death under the clinical cover of a supervised care environment. Diane stopped at a room at the end of the corridor. A beautiful cage, bolted down furniture, a window that opened exactly 1 inch, fresh flowers on the nightstand, already wilting in the recycled air. She turned to Graham with a smile that dropped its mask for half a second. "The consultant fee we discussed," she whispered, sliding a business card with a handwritten figure into his palm. "Monday. Have it cleared by then, and we will ensure a smooth transition." Graham pocketed the card without looking at it. "Monday," he confirmed. He turned to me, his hand finding my shoulder with that cold, practiced weight. "This is going to be the start of a whole new life for you, Dad. You will see." "Yes, it will, son. But not the one you planned." The interior of Graham's SUV smelled of leather conditioner and Victoria's sharp perfume, a residue that clung to the headrest like a chemical signature. I sat in the back seat as Graham pulled out of Pinewood's visitor lot, and I let my performance reach its crescendo. My jaw went slack. My breathing deepened into the shallow rhythm of unconsciousness. I slumped against the cold leather headrest, transforming myself into the empty vessel they wanted me to be. It took less than 3 minutes for them to forget I existed. Victoria twisted in the passenger seat, popping a piece of mint gum with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. "The facility really took the fight out of him." She laughed. The sound was brittle, metallic, the laugh of a woman who had never learned to feel for anything that did not carry a dollar sign. "He barely asked questions," Graham replied, his grip tightening on the wheel as they merged onto Highway 89. The November sun was low, turning the bare trees along the road into black skeletons against a bleeding orange sky. Good. Because Diane needs the admission paperwork signed by Sunday evening. I have already told Ada that her father showed signs of acute disorientation during the tour. She is halfway to signing the affidavit already. My stomach clenched behind the mask of sleep. They had been intercepting Ada's information for weeks. Every concerned call my daughter made to the farm, every text she sent asking about my health, had been filtered through Graham's curated narrative of decline. Graham asked if Ada would really go through with it. Victoria's reply was immediate and cold. If a biology teacher with university credentials signs off on the cognitive symptoms, no court in Vermont will question the guardianship petition. Ada is our rubber stamp. The car hit a pothole, and I let my head loll against the window without flinching. Every cell in my body screamed for me to sit up and tell them exactly what I knew. But the hearing aid was catching every syllable, every confession, every plan they believed was being spoken only to the air between them. Victoria's voice dropped then, taking on a quality I had not heard before. Contempt. Pure, distilled contempt for the dead. Ruth should have cooperated, she said. If she had just signed the early access agreement when we first approached her, none of this would have been necessary. She could have lived out her years in some quiet apartment in Burlington. Graham was silent for a moment. Then, she was stubborn. Like him. She was stupid, Victoria corrected. And look where it got her. I felt a hot wire of fury travel from my gut to my temples, but I kept every muscle still. My breathing stayed shallow. My eyes stayed closed, and the hearing aid kept recording. Patient as a hive in winter, storing every drop of their venom for the harvest to come. By the time they deposited me at the farmhouse door, I had enough audio to bury them both in separate graves. Victoria's heels clicked away across the frozen gravel, and Graham's SUV disappeared down the driveway into the gathering dusk. I stood in the doorway, letting the cold November air wash over me, and allowed my spine to straighten. "You just signed your own warrants," I whispered to the empty driveway. "Both of you." And your mother heard every word. Harlan Briggs did not look like a man who waged war for a living. He looked like a retired professor who had wandered into a law office and forgotten to leave. Silver-maned, 62, with reading glasses perpetually perched on the bridge of his nose and a cardigan that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. But I had known Harlan for 30 years. And I knew that behind those gentle academic eyes lived the sharpest legal mind in Washington County. Men who underestimated Harlan Briggs did not make the same mistake twice. His office occupied the 5th floor of a brick building in downtown Montpelier. The space was cluttered with the sedimentary layers of decades of practice. Legal volumes stacked on every horizontal surface, framed certificates yellowing behind glass. A single window that looked out over the State Street traffic with the quiet authority of a man who had won cases against half the firms visible from that view. I arrived looking like a man who had crawled out of a ditch. 2 days without proper sleep. The grit of the farm still crusted in the seams of my boots. The smell of propane still faintly clinging to my coat beneath the beeswax and cedar of the workshop. Harlan took one look at me, closed his office door, and poured 2 glasses of bourbon without asking. "Sit, Walter," he said, "and tell me what Graham has done." I did not begin with words. I placed the hearing aid on his desk, connected it to his computer, and pressed play. For 7 minutes, Harlan listened to the car recording without moving. Victoria's voice filled the room. Graham's complicity hung in the air like smoke. When the recording reached Victoria's assessment of Ruth, her casual dismissal of my wife's death as a consequence of stubbornness, Harlan removed his glasses and pressed the bridge of his nose. The only sign of emotion from a man who had spent a career listening to the worst humanity could offer. "There is more," I said. I connected the MP3 player and played the Diane Farrow recording. The 8%. The chemical compliance. The open-ended sedation. The Monday deadline. Harlan listened to the end, then stood and walked to his window. He remained there for a long moment, looking out at the traffic below. His reflection ghosting across the glass like a man deciding which weapon to pull from an extensive armory. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice carrying the measured weight of a man already building a legal fortress in his mind. "They need me admitted by Monday. The mineral auction closes Friday. The bridge loan payment is due Thursday." Harlan turned from the window. His eyes had changed. The gentle professor was gone, replaced by something harder. something that reminded me of the way a hawk's gaze sharpens the moment it spots movement in the grass below. "Then we have 4 days," he said. He reached for his phone and dialed a number from memory. I recognized the cadence of the exchange. Short, direct, authoritative. When he hung up, he told me he had contacted the head of the Vermont State Police Environmental Crimes Unit, an old colleague from his years in the Attorney General's office, a man who owed Harlan favors that had never been called in. But before we could build the trap, Harlan needed to show me the damage already done. He pulled up the county clerk's digital portal on his monitor, navigating to a section I had not known existed. There, filed 14 days before Ruth's death, was a restated last will and testament bearing my wife's signature. The document granted Graham immediate power of attorney and full ownership of the farm the moment I was declared incapacitated. It was a masterwork of forgery, every loop and stroke of Ruth's handwriting replicated with painstaking precision. Every loop except one detail that only a man who had watched his wife write for 46 years would notice. "Ruth developed a tremor in her final months," I said, my voice hollow, "from the brotificum affecting her nervous system. Her handwriting had a slight shake in every letter. This signature is too steady, too smooth. Whoever forged this did not know she was already sick." Harlan's pen scratched against his legal pad with the sound of teeth grinding. He confirmed that the court had not yet examined the will's authenticity. But the damage extended further. Graham had already used the forged document as collateral to secure a $42 million bridge loan against the farm's equity through a private lender connected to Granite Peak Energy. The money was not in Graham's personal accounts. It had been routed through the shell companies Arthur Vance had constructed, making it nearly invisible to standard forensic accounting. "Walter," Harlan said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to the register he reserved for the most critical moments in a courtroom. "If they have already taken the loan, they do not just need you in Pinewood. They need you gone before the first payment is due. If you are alive and competent when that payment comes, the entire structure collapses. The lender discovers the will is fraudulent, the loan defaults, and Graham faces immediate criminal exposure." The implications settled over me like a cold weight. This was not merely greed. This was a ticking financial bomb that required my death or incapacitation to prevent detonation. "We are not going to let it detonate on their terms," Harlan said, pulling a fresh legal pad from his drawer. "We are going to detonate it on ours." He laid out the plan with the precision of a general mapping a battlefield. The Maple Sugaring Festival. Saturday. My farm's annual tradition that drew the entire community to the property. 200 people. Neighbors. Local officials. The county press. A public stage where every word spoken would be heard by witnesses whose testimony could never be discredited. "We wire the property," Harlan said. "Every room. Every outbuilding. The festival grounds. We bring in the state police team disguised as contractors. When Graham arrives Saturday expecting a broken old man ready to sign away his legacy, he will find a trap so complete that his own words become the bars of his cell." I looked at Harlan, feeling the cold weight of the bourbon in my stomach and the colder weight of necessity in my chest. "And Ada?" I asked. "She arrives tomorrow morning." Harlan nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow morning is when we find out whether your daughter is a weapon or a shield. Either way, Walter, we need her on our side before Saturday." I stood, feeling the ache of 3 sleepless nights in every joint, but also feeling something I had not felt since Ruth's voice first filled my headphones in that Burlington parking lot. Direction. Purpose. The knowledge that I was no longer a man being swept toward a cliff by forces beyond his control, but a beekeeper positioning every frame and every comb for the moment the hive defends itself. 4 days, Walter," Harlan said as I reached the door. "Get your daughter. Get your evidence. And get ready to watch your son hear his mother's voice one last time." Ada arrived at dawn. The crunch of her tires on frozen gravel sounded like a countdown, each revolution of the wheels ticking away the seconds before her world would split in two. I watched from the kitchen window as she stepped out of her Subaru, still wearing the rumpled khakis and fleece pullover of a woman who had driven straight from her apartment without sleeping. She carried her leather satchel over one shoulder. The one I knew contained the commitment papers Graham had pre-signed and overnighted to her, with a note urging immediate action. She walked toward the porch with the measured steps of a scientist approaching a volatile experiment. No hug at the door. No daughterly warmth in her eyes as she crossed the threshold. She greeted me with a lingering diagnostic gaze, checking my pupils, my posture, the steadiness of my hands as I offered her coffee. She was not here as my daughter. She was here as Graham's instrument, measuring me for the cage he had built. "You look tired, Dad," she said, her voice carrying the same clinical flatness I had heard on the phone. "Graham mentioned your coordination was off during the Pinewood tour." I poured her coffee without responding. The kitchen was warm, the wood stove ticking with heat, the smell of strong espresso cutting through the lingering ghost of the morning frost. I let the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable, until she stopped scanning me for symptoms and started seeing me as a person. "I am not here to play patient, Ada," I said, my voice low and steady. "I am here to be your father. Sit down." Something flickered behind her eyes. A crack in the professional armor. She sat at the oak table, the same table where Ruth used to grade her biology homework on winter evenings, and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug as though it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. I placed the MP3 player and the noise-canceling headphones on the table between us. The scratched silver device looked impossibly small against the scarred oak surface, a tiny vessel carrying the weight of a murdered woman's final testimony. "This belonged to your mother," I said. "She hid it inside hive number 7 before she died. I found it last week. Inside are 43 recordings." I pushed the headphones toward her. "Listen, do not speak until the files are done. Then tell me whether your father is dangerous or whether your brother is." Ada stared at the device, her jaw tightening. I could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The part of her that trusted Graham's careful narrative of my decline fighting against the part that still remembered the smell of the honey house on summer mornings, the sound of her mother's laughter echoing through the maple grove. She put on the headphones with a weary, skeptical sigh. Her posture radiated the belief that she was humoring the confused ramblings of a grieving old man. I pressed play on file 1 and sat back. How many years of scientific training does it take to recognize the sound of your own mother, describing the exact pharmacological mechanism of her own murder? I watched the transformation happen in real time. The first 30 seconds, Ada's face held its clinical mask. She was listening, the way she listened to student presentations, evaluating, detached. Then Ruth's voice said the word brodifacoum, and I watched Ada's spine straighten as though someone had run an electric current through the chair. Her fingers gripped the table edge. The color drained from her face in stages, like watching a tide retreat from a shoreline. By the time Ruth described the bruising beneath her sleeves, the metallic taste, the Sunday honey deliveries, Ada's hands were shaking so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of her mug and pooled on the oak. She did not notice. Her eyes were fixed on a point beyond the kitchen wall, seeing something I could not follow. Perhaps she was recalculating every Sunday dinner, every phone call where Graham reported on Ruth's declining health, every lab result he had forwarded to her inbox with helpful annotations circling the abnormalities. I advanced the player to file 12, the one Ruth had recorded specifically for Ada. I knew it was coming. I had listened to it twice already, alone in the basement, and both times it had broken something inside me. Ruth's voice shifted. No longer the clinical pharmacist documenting evidence. Now, she was a mother speaking to her daughter, and the words she chose were a scalpel designed to cut through every layer of professional distance Ada had built between herself and the truth. "Ada, baby girl," Ruth said, her voice thick with a grief that transcended her own death. "If you are hearing this, it is because Graham thinks you are as blind as your father. He has been sending you falsified cognitive assessments for months. The lab results you received are from a private facility that does not verify patient identity. Your father is not sick, Ada. He is being erased, and your brother is using your credentials to sign the permission slip. Ada ripped the headphones off. The sound that escaped her throat was not a scream. It was something worse, a strangled, guttural sound that belonged to an animal discovering it had been standing on a trap all along. "Wait," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That is Mom. That is her voice. The Broda Facum. That is a super warfarin anticoagulant. It causes hemorrhagic events that are clinically indistinguishable from natural strokes. I taught this in my toxicology unit last semester." She stared at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was rapidly converting into something far more useful. Rage. "The lab results Graham sent me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never questioned them. He told me they came from your primary care physician. But the format was wrong. I noticed it, but I did not. I trusted him." She pressed both palms flat against the table, her breathing ragged, her biology teacher's brain now running at full capacity in a direction Graham never anticipated. "Brodifacoum has a half-life of 56 days in human tissue," she said, looking at me with eyes that were no longer diagnostic, but burning with purpose. If Mom's body still has trace levels, a targeted toxicology screen would confirm everything on these recordings. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but her grip was iron. "He used me, Dad," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. "He used my degree to build the cage around you. He made me his accomplice without my knowledge. You are not his accomplice, Ada. You are his mistake. He assumed your love for him was stronger than your love for the truth." She was silent for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. The wood stove settled with a soft thud. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare maples with a sound like whispered conspiracy. Then Ada looked up. The tears had stopped. The shaking had stopped. In their place was something I recognized from my own mirror. The cold, focused fury of a Pembroke who has been lied to for the last time. "He wants a scientist to sign those papers, Dad," she said, her voice like strategic steel. "I will give him exactly what he wants. I am going to make him feel safe, and then I am going to watch him try to explain Brodifacoum to a jury." I squeezed her hand. My daughter was back, and the wolves had just lost their rubber stamp. I saved file 37 for last because Ruth had titled it with one word that made my chest feel like it was caving in on itself. Emmett. Ada had gone home to prepare her roll for Saturday, leaving me alone in the farmhouse with the weight of what remained. The kitchen was dark, except for the blue glow of the MP, 3-player on the table and the amber flicker of the wood stove behind its iron grate. I sat in the silence, my finger hovering over the play button for a long time. I already knew what this file would contain. Some part of me had known since the moment Ruth whispered about Graham not working alone. But knowing and hearing are different species of pain. I pressed play. The recording was captured in the old tractor shed behind the barn. I could tell by the background. The faint smell of diesel seemed to seep through the speakers. The hollow echo of a metal-roofed structure. The distant lowing of the Henderson cattle from across the valley. Ruth must have left the device in her garden basket, hung on the hook beside the shed door, where she always kept it during her afternoon herb walks. Graham's voice came first. Low. Controlled. The tone of a man holding a leash. "The debts are cleared, Emmett. All 10,000. You are free of it. But I need something in return." Emmett's voice made my hands curl into fists against the tabletop. My youngest son, 31 years old, a voice that still carried the tremor of a man who had spent 3 years in the grip of opioids after a spinal injury in Afghanistan. A voice that still cracked with the pathetic, desperate gratitude of someone who believed his older brother was the only person in the world willing to throw him a rope. "What do you need?" Emmett asked. "Mom's health is declining. Dad is too stubborn to try modern supplements. I found an herbal compound online that could help her energy levels, but it has to be ordered through channels Dad would never approve of. You still have your old contacts, right? The ones from before. The pause that followed was thick enough to taste. I heard Emmett shift his weight. The scrape of a boot on concrete. I do not know, Graham. Ordering stuff like that is how I got in trouble last time. This is different, Graham said. His voice silky, with false reassurance. It is herbal. Completely natural. Dad is just too old-fashioned to understand. Do you want Mom to suffer because he refuses to adapt? I squeezed the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. The manipulation was surgical. Graham had identified every vulnerability in his brother's psyche and was pressing them with the precision of a man inserting a key into a lock he had designed himself. Emmett's guilt over his addiction. His desperate desire to contribute something positive to the family. His lingering belief that Graham was the responsible one, the anchor, the brother who had bailed him out when no one else would. You will be a hero, Emmett, Graham urged. Now go home and order the blue supplement. Mom needs it. The recording captured the sound of something being slid across a surface. A prepaid crypto card. I heard the plastic scrape against metal. Emmett's breathing changed. Faster. The respiration of a man who wanted to say no, but had been so thoroughly broken by years of dependency that the word had been removed from his vocabulary. Okay, Emmett whispered. Okay. For Mom. The file should have ended there. But Ruth's microphone caught an additional 40 seconds that turned my grief into something volcanic. After Emmett's footsteps faded from the shed, Graham remained. And in a muffled aside, perhaps speaking into his phone, perhaps simply thinking aloud, with the arrogance of a man who believed he was utterly alone, he said something that made the MP3 player slip from my numb fingers and clatter against the oak. And to think, I was the one who called in his dealer's location 2 years ago. Created the debt. Created the arrest. Created the gratitude. All for this moment. Graham had not merely exploited Emmett's addiction. He had manufactured it. Engineered his brother's ruin years in advance, building a tool from the wreckage of a boy who trusted him, sharpening that tool patiently until the moment arrived to use it as a murder weapon aimed at their own mother. I turned off the device. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than earth. My youngest son had carried the guilt of his mother's death for weeks, believing his hands had delivered the poison that killed her. And all along, those hands had been guided by a puppeteer who had been pulling strings since before Emmett even knew the stage existed. Graham did not just kill your mother, I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking for the first time since this nightmare began. He turned your love into the bullet, and he will answer for every single grain of that poison. I closed my eyes and let the rage settle. Then I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood. There was work to do. By 9 that evening, the farmhouse was a different animal. Milo Chandler arrived in a van marked Green Mountain Plumbing alongside 4 men in work coveralls, who carried themselves with the controlled alertness of professionals accustomed to operating in silence. Vermont State Police. Environmental Crimes Unit. Harlan had called in every favor owed to him across 3 decades of practice. They moved through the house with military precision. Fiber optic cameras threaded into the drywall behind family photographs. Microphones hidden inside the hollow spines of Ruth's recipe books on the kitchen shelf. Audio pickups embedded in the maple syrup display on the dining room hutch. Every wire, every lens, every transmitter was positioned with chain of custody protocols that Harlan supervised personally via video call from his office. Milo worked the festival grounds next. Speakers wired into the Sugar Shack's PA system, the one I used every year to announce the syrup grades and thank the community for coming. Those speakers would carry a different message this Saturday. Ada returned at midnight, rehearsing her performance with the focused intensity of a woman preparing for the role of her life. She practiced the clinical, detached tone of a daughter reluctantly supporting her father's institutionalization. Her face became a mask of professional resignation that made my heart ache to watch. I have to sound like I have given up on you, Dad, she said, positioning a microphone beneath the centerpiece on the dining table. It is the only way he drops his guard. I nodded. Make it convincing. He has spent months believing you are his weapon. Let him keep believing it, until the moment he hears his mother's voice coming from every speaker on this mountain. At 2 a.m, with the team hidden in the basement monitoring station, I made one final call. Graham answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and greed. Son, I said, letting my words tremble and drift like leaves on a winter current. The festival is Saturday. One last sugaring before I go to Pinewood. Can you come? Bring Victoria. I want to sign the papers there. In front of the community, so everyone knows I am doing this willingly. Graham could not contain the excitement in his voice. Of course, Dad. That is a beautiful idea. We will be there. I hung up and looked at the blinking green light of Milo's monitor in the darkened kitchen. The trap was set. The hive was wired. And on Saturday, the beekeeper would open the lid and let the whole valley hear what had been buzzing inside all along. Saturday morning broke over the Green Mountains with a stillness that felt like the earth holding its breath. No wind. No birdsong. Just the pale gray light of a November dawn sliding across the frozen fields like a blade being drawn from its sheath. I stood before the hallway mirror at 5:30, deliberately buttoning my cardigan unevenly, watching a stranger with hollow eyes and uncombed silver hair stare back at me. This scratchy wool was my costume. The mismatched buttons were my armor. The vacant, wandering gaze I practiced in the glass was the last mask I would ever need to wear. I moved through the house with the slow deliberation of a stage director making final adjustments before the curtain rises. A half-eaten piece of cold toast left on the counter, beside a mug of coffee gone gray. My reading glasses placed on the wrong shelf. A boot left untied by the door. Every detail a brushstroke in the portrait of a mind unraveling. For anyone who entered this kitchen before the festival began, the evidence of decline would be overwhelming and immediate. I checked the hidden monitor tucked behind the cereal boxes in the pantry. Milo's green indicator light pulsed steadily. Every camera was live. Every microphone was hot. Every pixel was streaming simultaneously to Harlan's secure server in Montpelier and to the Vermont State Police Mobile Command Unit parked 3 miles down the mountain road in a borrowed logging company trailer. I reached for my left ear and inserted the recording hearing aid. Then the right ear, where a second device sat. This one did not record. It received a live audio feed from the basement where 2 state investigators monitored the surveillance network in real time. If anything deviated from the plan, I would hear their voices in my ear like guardian angels whispering from behind the curtain. The preparations complete, I found myself drawn to the bedroom. The house was silent. The team was hidden. Ada would not arrive for another hour. I had one task left before the world descended upon my farm, and it was not tactical. It was personal. I sat on the edge of the bed Ruth and I had shared for 46 years. The quilt beneath my palms was worn soft by decades of use, the pattern faded but still carrying the geometry she had chosen when we were young, and the idea of old age was a foreign country neither of us expected to visit. Her pillow still held the faintest impression of her head. I had not washed the pillowcase. I could not. I navigated the MP3 player to file 43. The last recording Ruth ever made. The one she had titled simply, "For Walter, My Love." I had saved it. Through all the evidence files, all the conspiracy recordings, all the whispered horrors of her final weeks, I had kept this one untouched. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the morning I would need her most. I pressed play. Her voice was different here. Softer. Stripped of the clinical precision that armored her other recordings. She spoke the way she used to speak on Sunday mornings when we lay in bed, watching the light move across the ceiling. Neither of us in any hurry to face the world beyond our walls. "Walter," she began, and I heard the smile in her voice. The one that curved the left side of her mouth higher than the right. "I am recording this on a Tuesday afternoon while you are in the sugar shack checking the evaporator lines. I can see you from the kitchen window. You are wearing that ridiculous orange hat I bought you 15 years ago, and you are talking to yourself the way you always do when you think no one is watching." A sound escaped my throat, something between a laugh and a sob. I am not going to talk about Graham in this file. Or Victoria. Or the poison. You have 42 other recordings for that. This one is just for us. Just for the man who planted an oak tree on our wedding day and told me he would love me until it fell. She paused. I heard the kitchen clock ticking in the background of the recording. Our clock, still hanging in the same spot on the wall above the stove. "I know about your heart, Walter. The appointment you hid from me in August. The medication you take when you think I am not looking. I know you were trying to protect me from worry, and I love you for it. But you stubborn man, you cannot protect everyone by carrying it alone." I closed my eyes. She knew. Of course she knew. Ruth saw everything. "After this is over, after you have done what needs to be done, please take care of yourself. See the cardiologist. Take the medication properly. Eat something besides toast and black coffee." Her voice wavered then, the first and only time I heard it break across all 43 files. "I need you to live, Walter. Not for the farm, not for justice. For Emmett. For Ada. For the bees that will need someone to open Hive 7 next spring." The recording fell silent for 3 seconds. I thought it was over. Then her breath returned. Steadier now. Resolved. "Look for me in the hives, Walter. Every time they hum, that is me telling you I am proud. You are always the strong one. Do not let their lies make you feel small. And when it is time to let the valley hear the truth, remember that I am standing right beside you. I always was." The file ended. The bedroom was silent, except for the ticking of that same kitchen clock bleeding through the walls. I sat motionless, letting the tears fall without wiping them. There was no shame in this room, no audience, just a man and the ghost of the woman who had loved him well enough to fight for his life from beyond the reach of her own. "I hear you, Ruth," I whispered. "And I am ready." I placed the MP3 player in my breast pocket, close to my heart, and walked out of the bedroom for the last time as a hunted man. By 8:30, the farm had transformed. Cars lined the long gravel drive. The smell of boiling maple sap poured from the sugar shack in sweet, thick clouds that hung in the cold air like a blessing. Neighbors arrived carrying covered dishes and thermoses of cider. Children chased each other between the bare maple trunks. Carl stood by the main evaporator, wearing his ceremonial sugaring apron, stirring a batch with the same wooden paddle his father had used before him. The maple sugaring festival was a tradition older than my marriage. Every November, when the last of the sap had been collected and the first batches of the season were ready for grading, the community gathered on Pembroke land to celebrate the harvest. 200 people, families I had known for decades, local officials, the volunteer fire department, the elementary school teacher, who brought her class every year to learn how sap becomes syrup. Today, they would learn something else entirely. I shuffled among them with my costume firmly in place. Vacant smile. Wandering gaze. A few neighbors touched my arm with gentle concern, asking how I was holding up since Ruth. I mumbled responses that trailed into nothing, projecting the image of a mind losing its grip. Ada circulated nearby, her face a mask of sad, professional resignation, playing the role of the devoted daughter, preparing to do the difficult thing. Then, at 9:15, the crunch of expensive tires on frozen gravel cut through the festival noise like a scalpel through warm skin. I looked toward the driveway and saw the black SUV gliding up the hill. Behind it, Victoria's silver sedan, and behind that, a white van I recognized from the Pinewood Haven parking lot. 3 vehicles, 3 predators, and 200 witnesses who had come for maple syrup and were about to watch a dead woman tear the mask off a murderer. "Here come the wolves," I whispered, adjusting the hearing aid in my left ear. "Time to open the hive." Graham crossed the festival grounds with the stride of a man collecting a prize. Victoria walked half a step behind, her charcoal coat cutting a sharp silhouette against the homespun flannel of the gathered community. Diane Farrow remained by the white van, arms folded, watching like a vulture waiting for larger predators to finish. I sat at the main sugaring table, surrounded by neighbors sampling the first pour of the season. My posture slumped. My gaze wandered. 200 people milled around the property, their laughter rising in white clouds above the festival. None of them knew that beneath the surface, a dead woman was about to address the crowd. Graham leaned down, placing both hands on the table. His cologne cut through the sweet maple steam. "Morning, Dad. Beautiful turnout. Ready to talk about those papers?" Victoria placed a leather folder on the table with a deliberate thud between the plates of pancakes and the ceramic jug of fresh syrup. 3 tab markers protruded from the edge. Power of attorney, Pinewood admission, land transfer. 3 documents designed to dismantle my life in the time it takes to write a name. "Just your signature, Walter," Victoria said, smooth as polished ice. "Then you can enjoy the festival without any more worry." I stared at the folder, let my hand drift toward it, then pull back. "Sign?" I mumbled. "What am I signing?" Graham pressed a heavy fountain pen into my hand. Gold-tipped. Cold. "Right here, Dad. Where the tabs are. You remember how to write your name, don't you?" I positioned the nib above the first signature line. My hand trembled. Victoria leaned in, her perfume filling my nostrils. "Good, Walter. Just let the pen touch the paper." Graham's breathing was audible, rapid, his eyes fixed on the pen tip, with the intensity of a man watching a lottery ball drop. A sharp electronic chirp sounded from my breast pocket. Milo's signal. The feed was live. The trap was armed. The pen clattered onto the table. I straightened my spine. The fog evaporated from my eyes. I looked directly at Graham, and for the first time in 6 days, I let my son see the man he had been trying to bury. "I am not signing anything, Graham," I said. Clear. Cold. Carrying across the silent table, I pressed the button in my pocket. The Sugar Shack PA system crackled to life, and from every speaker mounted along the festival grounds, Ruth's voice poured out like a flood breaking through a dam. "Walter, our son is poisoning me. Graham has been lacing the honey from Hive 7 with Brodifacoum." 200 heads turned. 200 conversations died. The only competing sound was the steady bubbling of maple sap in the evaporator, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding beside it. Graham's face drained white. Mouth first, then cheeks, then forehead, where a vein pulsed against suddenly transparent skin. His mother's voice continued its clinical narration across the mountainside. "He brings me the honey every Sunday. He watches me put it in my tea. He knows exactly how long it takes." Victoria lunged for the folder. I slammed my palm down on the leather before her fingers reached it. The crack echoed like a gunshot across the silent festival. "Your mother has a few things to say to you, Graham," I said. "And so do 200 of your neighbors." The recording shifted to Victoria's car confession. Her own voice filled the mountain air. Ruth should have cooperated. She was stupid. And look where it got her. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Carl stepped forward from the evaporator, his face a mask of cold fury, blocking the southern trail. The Sugar Shack doors burst open. 4 officers in tactical vests marked Vermont State Police emerged at a controlled run. From the tree line, 3 more materialized from the maple grove where they had waited since dawn. Victoria pivoted toward me, her fingers clawing for my throat. A broad-shouldered officer intercepted her mid-stride, pinning her against the table with a thud that scattered cider cups and sent the unsigned documents sliding into the mud. Graham did not run. His knees buckled, and he sank into the frozen earth, his designer coat absorbing the black soil of the land he had tried to steal. The sound from his throat was not words. It was a keening, the noise of a man whose reality had shattered in the time it took his dead mother to speak 47 words. "I just wanted the money," he sobbed, hands clawing mud. "I did not mean for her to die." Handcuffs snapped. First Victoria, screaming about legal overreach. Then Diane, extracted from the white van she had tried to reverse down the driveway. Ruth's voice continued from the speakers. Calm, clinical, relentless. The dead do not pause for dramatic effect. They tell the truth, until the living have nowhere to hide. Ada stepped forward from the crowd, her mask gone, replaced by fury. She stood over Graham's crumpled form, her shadow falling across him like a verdict. "You used my credentials to kill our mother," she said. Quiet words, but in 200 held breaths. They reached every ear on the mountainside. "You made me your accomplice." The officers lifted Graham to his feet and led him toward a cruiser, painting the bare trees in alternating blue and red. I watched the predators become prey, feeling a weight lift that I had carried since the morning I found Ruth on the kitchen floor. Carl gripped my arm, holding me steady. Neighbors pressed close, hands touching my shoulders, voices murmuring things I could not fully hear. Ruth's recording hissed into static. The speakers fell silent, and in that silence, the only sound was the steady bubbling of maple sap in the evaporator, transforming raw material into something sweet, the way it always had, the way it always would. The last police cruiser turned off the mountain road at 11:30, its taillights winking out behind the tree line like dying embers. The festival grounds were empty now. Paper cups littered the frozen grass. The evaporator had been shut down, its copper belly still ticking as it cooled. The smell of maple syrup hung in the air like a memory refusing to leave, mixing with the faint chemical residue of exhaust from the departing vehicles. Ada stood beside me on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold that had nothing to do with November. The community had dispersed in clusters, some lingering to offer handshakes and murmured condolences that felt more like congratulations. Carl was the last to leave, gripping my hand with both of his before climbing into his truck without a word. Some things between old men do not require language. "It is over, Dad," Ada whispered, her breath hitching in the biting wind. I looked down the long gravel drive where the cruiser lights had vanished. "No, Ada. Now, the real work begins." She frowned, but I was already moving. Down the porch steps, past the sugaring table, still streaked with mud and scattered documents, toward the back trail that wound into the maple grove. Something had been pulling at me since the moment the handcuffs closed around Graham's wrists. A weight I could not set down. A name I had not spoken aloud all day. Emmett. He had been here. I knew it the way I knew the seasons by the angle of light through the maples. Harlan had positioned him at the old barn during the festival as a lookout, ensuring Graham had not brought additional allies. But after the arrests, after the sirens and the screaming, Emmett had vanished. I had expected him at my side for the aftermath. His absence spoke louder than Graham's confession. The trail into the deep grove was dark, despite the midday hour. November had stripped the canopy bare, but the trunks grew close here. Old-growth maples whose girth blocked the weak sun. The ground was carpeted with decomposing leaves that muffled my footsteps, releasing the smell of wet tannin and frozen earth with each stride. I followed the trail by instinct, past the tap stations, past the old stone wall that marked the property boundary, toward the ancient sugar maple at the grove's heart. The one Ruth called the grandmother tree because its trunk was wide enough to hide inside. I found him there. Emmett sat curled at the base of the grandmother tree, his knees pulled to his chest, his back pressed against the rough bark, as though trying to merge with the wood and disappear. His face was slick with tears that had frozen in pale tracks on his cheeks. His hands shook with a tremor that was not cold. It was guilt made physical. Poison made manifest in the body of a boy who believed he had delivered death to his own mother. When he saw me, he scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the frozen leaves. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, carrying the look of an animal, caught between the need to flee and the inability to move. "Don't touch me, Dad," he gasped, his voice cracking like thin ice. "I am the one who bought it. I ordered the poison. I killed her. I did not stop walking." I crossed the remaining distance between us and pulled him into my arms with a force that left no room for argument. He resisted for exactly 2 seconds. Then he collapsed against my chest, and the sound that came from him was not crying. It was something deeper, something primal. The sound of a man drowning in a guilt that had been engineered by the very person who threw him the anchor. "You did not buy poison, Emmett," I said into his hair, holding him the way I held him when he was 7 years old and terrified of thunderstorms. "You bought a lie, and the man who sold it to you is already in chains." He shook his head violently against my shoulder. "I should have known. I should have questioned it. The vendors, the crypto. It felt wrong, and I did it anyway, because he said it would help her. Graham manufactured your weakness, son. He created the debt. He arranged the arrest that put you in his pocket. He spent years building the trap so that when the moment came, you would do exactly what he asked without question. That is not your failure. That is his crime." Emmett pulled back, his face a ruin of salt and shadow. He looked at me as though searching for permission to believe what I was saying, as though the absolution of a father could outweigh the crushing certainty of his own hands placing blue supplements into his mother's medicine cabinet. "Mom knew," he whispered. "She knew it was me bringing them. She knew it was Graham using you as the delivery method. She recorded everything. She left specific instructions to protect you. Your mother died fighting for your freedom, Emmett. Do not dishonor that by carrying a guilt that belongs to your brother." He closed his eyes. The trembling slowed. I held him until his breathing steadied into something approaching calm. The cold November air wrapping around us, both beneath the bare branches of the grandmother tree. In the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a dead trunk. The rhythm sounded like a heartbeat returning to normal after a long illness. As I helped him to his feet, his hand gripping mine with the desperate strength of a man who has just been pulled from deep water, Emmett leaned close. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Dad, there is a second package. Graham told me to hide it in the sugar shack last week, behind the old maple syrup drums from '92. He said it was a backup supplement in case the first supply ran out. It is still there." The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. I steadied myself against the tree trunk, my mind racing. A second package, hidden in the sugar shack. The same sugar shack where Graham had rigged the propane. I led Emmett back toward the house, settling him in the kitchen with Ada, who wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and pressed hot tea into his shaking hands. Then I called Harlan. 20 minutes later, we stood in the sugar shack. Harlan wore blue nitrile evidence gloves, his breath forming clouds in the cold as I directed him toward the back corner, where the old maple syrup drums from 1992 sat gathering dust. Behind the third drum, wedged into a gap between the corrugated wall and the concrete floor, was a vacuum-sealed plastic pouch no larger than a deck of playing cards. Harlan extracted it with surgical care, holding it up to the pale light filtering through the frost-covered window. Inside, a clear liquid shifted with the viscosity of something far more concentrated than any herbal supplement. "This is not brodifacoum at the dosage Ruth described," Harlan said, his voice grim. "This is concentrated, military-grade anticoagulant. A single dose of this would cause fatal internal hemorrhaging within 6 hours." He looked at me, his reading glasses reflecting the cold light. "Walter, this was not a backup for the honey. This was the kill shot. Intended for your first night at Pinewood." I stared at the pouch. A small plastic envelope containing my death, designed to be slipped into my evening medication at a facility where the head nurse was a paid conspirator and the paperwork would list the cause as a stress-induced stroke. "Bag it," I said, my voice flat. "Upload the photos to the cloud. And call the state attorney general." Harlan nodded, already reaching for his phone. The response came within the hour. 3 words on his screen that changed the trajectory of everything. Order the exhumation. Wake her up, I whispered, staring at the message. Tell Ruth I am finishing the harvest. The cemetery sat on a low hill overlooking the valley. The kind of quiet Vermont resting place where the headstones are granite and the families go back generations. The morning was gray, windless. The fog clung to the iron gates like a congregation of ghosts, reluctant to disperse. I arrived before the equipment, standing alone at the perimeter of the family plot with my hands deep in my coat pockets and the cold seeping through my boots into the frozen earth beneath. Ruth's headstone was simple. Her name, the dates, and a line she had chosen herself years ago when we made our arrangements together at the kitchen table over coffee. She tended what others forgot. I had always assumed she meant her garden. Now I understood she meant the truth. The backhoe arrived at 7, its yellow bulk obscene against the quiet rows of stone and dormant grass. The operator was a young man who would not meet my eyes, and I was grateful for that. Some tasks require the mercy of anonymity. Behind the machine came the state forensic team in a white van, their movements efficient and clinical. Ada stood beside me, her face set in the professional mask she wore when the biology teacher needed to disappear and the scientist needed to emerge. Her hand found mine as the engine roared to life, and the metal teeth bit into Vermont soil. How do you watch the earth give back someone you buried with your own hands? You stand still. You breathe. You remind yourself that this violation is temporary, and the justice it purchases is permanent. The excavation took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of mechanical rhythm, of displaced earth piling beside the grave, like a dark monument to everything that had gone wrong. I did not look away. I owed Ruth that much. When the vault finally emerged, streaked with clay and moisture, Ada squeezed my hand so tightly I felt the bones shift. We are being careful, Mr. Pembroke, the lead investigator said, his voice carrying the rehearsed gentleness of a man who has delivered these words before. She will be treated with dignity. She was denied dignity in life, I replied, watching them secure the vault onto the transport platform. Give it to her now. The van doors closed with a heavy metallic thud that echoed against the marble headstones. I stood watching until the vehicle disappeared down the cemetery road, carrying my wife toward a sterile laboratory where strangers would search her bones for the signature of her son's betrayal. I discovered through Harlan that afternoon that the original coroner's report had been conveniently lost in a local server crash 4 months prior. Arthur Vance's digital fingerprints were all over the county's IT infrastructure. The corruption was not limited to a single son's greed. It was systemic, a network of deleted files and redirected records designed to ensure that Ruth's death remained a closed case, gathering dust in a forgotten drawer. The toxicology results arrived 26 hours later. I was sitting in Harlan's office when the medical examiner called on speakerphone. Her voice was measured, professional, but I caught the undercurrent of controlled outrage that only someone who has spent their career cataloging the dead can carry. Bradifocum concentration in liver tissue was approximately 50 times the lethal threshold for a woman of Mrs. Pembroke's body mass, she said. Bone marrow samples confirm chronic exposure over a period of no less than 10 weeks. The hemorrhagic event listed as cause of death was not spontaneous. It was the direct and predictable result of sustained anticoagulant poisoning. The room was silent, except for the scratch of Harlan's pen on his legal pad. It was not a stroke, Mr. Pembroke, the examiner said, her voice softening. It was an execution. I closed my eyes. The word settled into my chest, like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well. Execution. Not accident. Not natural decline. Not the gentle surrender of an aging body. My wife was murdered with pharmaceutical precision over the course of 70 days, and the instrument of that murder was delivered by a son who smiled at her across the breakfast table every Sunday morning. Harlan ended the call and immediately placed another. Within the hour, the charges against Graham and Victoria were formally upgraded to first-degree murder. In Vermont, That carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The legal architecture that Graham had spent months constructing to steal my land had become the scaffolding of his own permanent cage. Graham's lawyer called this morning, Harlan said, setting his phone down with the deliberate care of a man handling something distasteful. He wants to make a deal, full testimony against Victoria and Diane in exchange for a manslaughter reduction. The word deal sat between us like a dead animal on a clean table. Tell his lawyer my son can keep his deals, I said, my voice carrying a finality that surprised even me. I want the truth spoken in a courtroom, not whispered in a hallway to save a murderer from the consequences he chose. Harlan nodded. A single dip of the chin that carried the weight of 30 years of shared understanding. 3 days later, I drove east. The road climbed out of the valley toward the Green Mountains, the landscape shifting from farmland to forest as the elevation increased. The rehabilitation center sat in a clearing surrounded by white pines, the building itself a modest structure of wood and glass that smelled of floor cleaner and pine sol when I pushed through the front doors. Emmett was waiting in the visiting room, a sunlit space with large windows that looked out over a snow-dusted mountain ridge. He sat in a wooden chair, his hands folded in his lap, and when he looked up at me, I saw something I had not seen in his eyes for nearly a decade. Clarity. The fog of guilt and chemical dependency had lifted just enough to reveal the boy underneath, the one who used to follow me through the apiaries, asking questions about the queen and the workers and the dance they did to communicate. I did not think you would come, Dad, he said, his voice small. I have spent 40 years coming for you, Emmett, I replied, settling into the chair across from him. I am not stopping now. We did not talk about the case. We did not talk about lawyers or evidence or the machinery of justice grinding forward in courtrooms we would both eventually have to enter. Instead, Emmett asked about the hives, about the winter preparations, about the new grafts Ruth had been developing before she died. Mom said the new hybrids would take 3 years, he said, his gaze drifting toward the mountains visible through the window. She told me they would produce twice the honey of the standard colonies. I want to see them bloom, Dad. I reached across and took his hand. The skin was dry, papery, but the grip was firm, present. Then stay clean, Emmett, I said. The bees need a Pembroke to look after them, and I am not going to be around forever. He met my eyes, and for the first time since Ruth died, I saw something in my youngest son that looked like a future rather than a ruin. I will be there, Dad, he said. 3 years. I will be there. I squeezed his hand and held on, watching the November light move across the mountains, knowing that somewhere beneath the frozen soil of a cemetery in the valley below, the truth was finally free. And somewhere in a sterile lab, Ruth's body was delivering its final testimony, the one her son could not silence, the one that would follow Graham into a courtroom and speak louder than any lawyer's deal. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and decades of accumulated judgment. Washington County Superior Court was not a grand cathedral of law. It was a working building with scarred oak benches, fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency designed to erode patience, and windows that looked out over a parking lot where the November rain collected in gray pools. But on this Tuesday morning, it held the weight of a murder trial, and every seat in the gallery was filled. I sat in the front row between Ada and Emmett. My daughter wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse, her hair pulled back with the severity of a woman preparing to deliver testimony that would condemn her own brother. Emmett sat rigid beside me, his hands clasped in his lap, his fingernails bitten to the quick. He had been granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation. The state had determined that his role as an unwitting instrument did not constitute criminal intent. But immunity does not erase the memory of blue supplements handed to a mother with a smile. Across the aisle, Graham sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit properly. 6 weeks of county jail had carved the flesh from his frame, leaving the expensive fabric hanging at the shoulders like a costume from a previous life. His eyes were hollow, his leg bounced continuously beneath the table with the manic energy of a caged animal. Beside him, Victoria Slade sat with her spine straight and her gaze fixed on a point above the judge's bench, as though the proceedings were beneath her attention. She had refused all plea negotiations. She intended to fight. The prosecution opened with the recordings. The state's attorney, a woman named Claire Dunham, with a voice like tempered steel, played the audio files in chronological sequence through the courtroom's speaker system. Ruth's voice filled the room the same way it had filled the festival grounds. But here, in the confined space of a legal chamber, the effect was different, more intimate, more damning. Every word bounced off the oak paneling and settled into the jury's consciousness like sediment finding the bottom of still water. I watched the 12 faces in the jury box as Ruth described the broda facum, the Sunday deliveries, the metallic taste, the bruising she hid beneath long sleeves. Several jurors leaned forward unconsciously, drawn toward the speakers as though proximity could somehow change what they were hearing. One woman in the second row pressed her hand over her mouth. A man in the back closed his eyes and shook his head in slow, rhythmic denial. When the car recording played, Victoria's voice echoing with casual cruelty through the high-fidelity speakers, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ruth should have cooperated. She was stupid. And look where it got her. The words hung in the air like a verdict delivered before the jury had even begun deliberation. Graham's attorney objected. Overruled. The recording continued. The pharmacist testified next. Samuel Henderson, 70 years old. Wire-rimmed spectacles and the steady hands of a man who had counted pills for half a century behind the same counter in the same small town. He explained that Ruth had visited his shop in Montpelier under a false name, bringing honey samples for informal analysis. He had flagged the results to a colleague at the state health department, but the report had disappeared into a bureaucratic void. Deleted, he now understood, by Arthur Vance's network of compromised county officials. Mrs. Pembroke did not look sick to me, Henderson said, adjusting his glasses with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of every word spoken under oath. She looked scared of her own kitchen. The defense objected. Speculation. Sustained. But the jury had already heard it. Some truths do not require legal admissibility to lodge themselves in the human conscience. Ada took the stand at 2:15 in the afternoon. The courtroom shifted as she settled into the witness chair, her posture carrying the particular authority of a woman who understood the science of death at a molecular level. Claire Dunham guided her through the toxicology with methodical precision. Broda facum is a second-generation superwarfarin anticoagulant, Ada explained, her voice steady, her eyes moving across the jury, with the practiced ease of a teacher, ensuring comprehension. It inhibits the vitamin K epoxide reductase enzyme, preventing the synthesis of functional clotting factors. At the concentrations found in my mother's tissue, the compound would have caused progressive, irreversible coagulopathy over a period of approximately 10 to 12 weeks. She paused. Let the science settle. Then delivered the translation the jury needed. In simple terms, my mother's blood lost the ability to clot. Every vessel in her body became a potential source of uncontrolled hemorrhage. The stroke that killed her was not a stroke at all. It was a catastrophic internal bleed triggered by a poison that had been systematically destroying her vascular system for months. My mother did not have a stroke, Ada said, and her professional mask slipped for exactly 1 second. Beneath it, I saw the daughter, the fury, the grief compressed into a single sentence that landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped from a great height. She was drowned in her own blood. The gallery was silent. A juror wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Graham's attorney did not cross-examine. There was nothing to ask that would not make the answer worse. Emmett took the stand at 4. His testimony was shorter, quieter. He described Graham's manipulation in a voice that cracked at the seams but held together long enough to deliver the essential architecture of the deception. The manufactured debt, the crypto card, the framing of the poison as an herbal supplement, the promise, that he would be a hero. "I loved my mother," Emmett said, his eyes fixed on the oak railing of the witness box because he could not bear to look at Graham. "And my brother used that love to turn me into the weapon that killed her. I did not know what was in those packages, but I will carry the weight of delivering them for the rest of my life." The prosecution introduced the crypto transaction records. The darknet vendor communications traced to Graham's IP address, the audio from the tractor shed recording, where Graham admitted to engineering Emmett's arrest 2 years prior. Each piece of evidence was a brick added to a wall that was growing higher around the defense table with every passing hour. Claire Dunham rested the prosecution's case at 5:45. The courtroom emptied in murmured clusters, the gallery separating into those who needed fresh air and those who needed to weep in private. I remained seated, watching Graham's attorney shuffle papers with the frantic energy of a man searching for an exit that did not exist. As the bailiff called for adjournment, Graham's lawyer leaned toward Victoria and whispered something urgent. Victoria's response was visible from across the room. She straightened her spine, smoothed her blazer, and smiled. The smile of a woman who had decided that if the ship was sinking, she would steer it directly into the reef. "My client will testify tomorrow," Victoria's attorney announced to the judge. "She wishes to address the court personally." The judge nodded. The gavel fell, and I walked out of the courtroom knowing that tomorrow, Victoria Slade would take the stand and attempt to justify the unjustifiable. I had seen that particular brand of arrogance before. In the orchard, in the car, in the way she spoke about Ruth as though my wife were a mathematical obstacle rather than a human being. Tomorrow, that arrogance would become the final nail in her own coffin. And 200 people in a Vermont community already knew it. Victoria Slade took the oath with the composure of a woman who believed she was the smartest person in any room she entered. She settled into the witness chair, the way a monarch settles into a throne, her back straight, her chin elevated at an angle that suggested the proceedings were a formality she was tolerating rather than a trial that would determine the remainder of her natural life. Her attorney had counseled against this. The whispered argument at the defense table that morning had been visible to everyone in the gallery, but Victoria had overruled her own lawyer with a single sharp shake of her head, and now she sat beneath the fluorescent lights with the calm of a woman about to deliver a lecture to an audience she considered beneath her. The prosecution began gently. Claire Dunham approached the witness stand with the measured pace of a hunter who knows the prey has walked into an open field. She asked simple questions first. Background, education, professional history. Victoria answered with polished ease, describing her career in financial planning with the fluency of someone delivering a keynote speech. She spoke of asset management and fiduciary responsibility as though these were the topics at hand rather than the murder of a 70-year-old woman. Then Dunham shifted. "Miss Slade, in the recording dated October 15th, you described the Pembroke family as, and I quote, a collection of liabilities. Can you explain what you meant?" Victoria did not hesitate. "I meant exactly what I said. Walter Pembroke is a 74-year-old man with a heart condition, managing a multi-million-dollar land asset with no succession plan. His youngest son is a convicted addict. His daughter had no interest in the property. The land was being wasted. I saw an opportunity to create value where none was being realized." A murmur moved through the gallery like wind through dry grass. Dunham let it settle before continuing. "And Ruth Pembroke? Was she also a liability?" Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ruth was resistant to progress. She refused to discuss the mineral rights. She refused to consider the development potential. She was an obstacle to a transaction that would have benefited everyone, including yourself, Dunham said. "To the tune of approximately $12 million in personal commission. I do not apologize for being compensated for my expertise." The cross-examination accelerated. Dunham introduced the recording of Victoria's phone call with Diane Farrow, played the specific segment where Victoria discussed open-ended sedation, asked Victoria to explain what she meant by the phrase, "men his age have strokes under stress." And that was when Victoria Slade made the decision that would haunt the legal textbooks of Vermont for decades to come. She chose to justify it. The biological decline was already happening, Victoria said, her voice rising with a conviction that bordered on evangelical. Ruth was 67. Walter is 74. These are not young people building futures. They are people occupying space on land that could generate $42 million in mineral wealth. I did not create their mortality. I simply acknowledged it. The courtroom went rigid. I felt Ada's hand grip my forearm with a force that would leave bruises. Some people, Victoria continued, her eyes sweeping the jury with the absolute certainty of a woman who cannot fathom disagreement, are architects of progress. And some are simply obstacles. Ruth chose to be an obstacle. The result was inefficient, yes. Regrettable, perhaps. But the land does not care who signs the deed. Claire Dunham stood motionless for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to the jury, letting Victoria's words exist in the silence, without competition. Miss Slade, Dunham said quietly, did you kill Ruth Pembroke? Victoria's composure cracked. Not into remorse, into fury. Her eyes flashed beneath the courtroom lights, and her voice rose to a pitch that made the court reporter's fingers freeze above the keys. I did not kill her. I freed the land from her stagnation. She was dying anyway. Everyone dies. I simply removed the inefficiency from the timeline. An audible gasp swept the gallery. A juror in the front row recoiled physically, pressing back against her chair, as though Victoria's words carried a contagion she did not want to breathe. The judge raised his gavel but did not need to strike it. The room had already gone silent with the particular stillness that follows a detonation. No further questions, Dunham said, her voice a calm blade in the aftermath. Let the record show the defendant's own words. But the destruction was not complete. Graham's attorney, sensing the collapse of any shared defense strategy, rose and produced a document that sent the final shockwave through the courtroom. A life insurance policy, taken out by Victoria Slade on Graham Pembroke. $2 million. Dated 3 weeks before Ruth's death. Graham turned in his chair. His face, already gaunt from weeks of incarceration, went the color of old bone. He stared at Victoria with the dawning comprehension of a man realizing he had been standing on a trapdoor the entire time. You were going to kill me too, he whispered. The microphone at the defense table caught it. The jury heard every syllable. Victoria did not deny it. She looked at Graham with the cold assessment of a woman evaluating an asset that had depreciated below usefulness. You were always a means to an end, Graham. Surely you knew that. The judge slammed the gavel 3 times to restore order. The gallery erupted in overlapping voices. Victoria's attorney dropped his head into his hands, and across the aisle, Graham Pembroke began to weep with the broken, shuddering sobs of a man who had sold his soul to a woman who never intended to pay. The verdict came 4 hours later. The jury deliberated through lunch and returned at 3:45 with a decision that took less than 90 seconds to read. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of financial fraud. Guilty of elder abuse. For both defendants. On all counts. Graham collapsed forward against the defense table, his forehead hitting the wood with a hollow thud. The keening that escaped his throat filled the corridor outside the courtroom as the bailiffs moved in. Victoria remained upright. Still, her eyes fixed on the state seal above the judge's bench as though she could negotiate with the wall itself. Diane Farrow, tried separately but sentenced the same afternoon, received 15 years for conspiracy and elder abuse. Her nursing license was revoked permanently. She attempted an apology from the stand that dissolved into incoherent weeping before the first sentence was complete. The judge reserved her harshest language for the final sentencing. She cited the premeditated nature of the conspiracy, the exploitation of familial trust, and the particular cruelty of using a son as an unwitting weapon against his own mother. Life imprisonment, she said, her voice carrying the finality of a door being welded shut, without the possibility of parole. For both defendants. The gavel fell for the last time. A sound like a period at the end of a very long, dark sentence. As the bailiffs led them away, Victoria turned her head toward me. Her eyes held no remorse, no fear, only the cold residue of a woman who still believed she was right, and the world was simply too small to understand. "You think you have won, old man?" she said. Her voice a poisonous whisper that cut through the noise of the departing gallery. "You are still alone in the dirt." I met her gaze and held it until the steel door closed between us. Then I looked at Ada on my left, at Emmett on my right, at Harlan, standing behind us with his hand on my shoulder. "No, Victoria," I said to the closed door. "I am not alone, and you will never touch this soil again. Justice is not a warm blanket. It is a cold, hard floor that you finally stop falling through." And as I walked out of that courtroom into the gray November afternoon, I realized that for the first time since finding Ruth on the kitchen floor, the ground beneath me was solid. The first warm morning arrived without announcement. I woke before dawn not from an alarm, but from silence. The kind of silence that belongs only to a house no longer under siege. No engine idling on the ridge road. No unfamiliar boots on frozen ground. No pharmaceutical sweetness masked beneath the smell of breakfast honey. Just stillness. The honest, earned stillness of a man who had outlived his own murder. I pulled on Ruth's old cardigan and stepped onto the porch. The valley stretched below in ribbons of fog, the sugar maples just beginning to blush at their tips. March had come to Vermont the way it always does, reluctantly, dragging winter behind it like a child unwilling to release a blanket. 3 months since the verdict. 3 months since Victoria's face went blank as the judge pronounced life without parole. 3 months since Graham was led from the courtroom in chains without looking back. 3 months since Diane Farrow began her 15-year sentence where no one calls her nurse anymore. The land was quiet now. Quiet the way it should have been all along. Ada arrived at 7:30. Her truck loaded with new hive bodies she'd built over the winter. Dovetail joints, hand-sanded cedar, copper roof caps that caught the early light, like small churches. "Morning, Dad." She kissed my forehead. Emmett called. 30 minutes out. Emmett had been clean for 91 days. He called me every evening at 8. Never missed. Sometimes we talked for an hour about nothing. Sometimes we sat in silence on the line, just breathing together, proving to each other we were still here. He arrived in Carl's old pickup, thinner than I remembered but steadier. His eyes were clear. He wore work boots, real ones, mud-crusted and honest, and when he stepped out, he walked straight to me and held on. "I'm ready," he said. "I know you are." We carried the new hive bodies down the slope together. Ada, Emmett, Carl, Milo from Burlington, and Harlan, leaning against the fence, claiming his knees weren't built for hillsides. The apiary sat in its clearing, the way Ruth had designed it 40 years ago. South-facing, sheltered by white pines, close to the wildflower meadow. 7 stands. 6 had been empty since she died. Today we would fill them again. Ada had sourced Carniolan queens from the Champlain Valley, the same strain Ruth always preferred. The nucleus colonies arrived in wooden transport boxes, humming with 10,000 lives each, vibrating against our palms like small engines. I opened hive number 7 last. Ruth's colony had survived the winter on stored honey and stubbornness. The cluster was tight and healthy, already building fresh comb. They'd made it through without their keeper. They'd made it through on what she'd left behind. "She bred them strong," Ada said. "She bred everything strong." We worked until noon, transferring frames, checking queens, marking entrances with Ruth's colored thumbtack system, blue for new queens, yellow for second year, red for colonies needing attention. The system was hers. We simply inherited it. When we finished, I watched the flight paths establish themselves in visible highways between hive and meadow, mapped by scouts in minutes, refined by thousands within the hour. Order from chaos, purpose from loss. Ruth would have stood here with her clipboard, recording orientation flights in that meticulous handwriting. She cataloged everything. She trusted evidence over intuition, data over hope. It was that instinct, that pharmacist's devotion to documentation, that had saved us all. That evening, after everyone had gone home, after Ada and Emmett and I had eaten soup in comfortable near silence, I walked alone to the apiary one last time. The sun painted the hive roofs in copper and rose. I sat on Ruth's bench, the one I'd built for our 30th anniversary, and listened. A healthy hive at dusk produces not a buzz, but a hum. A unified tone from thousands of lives working towards something none of them will live to see. They build for the next generation. They store honey they will never taste. They defend a queen whose reign will outlast them all. Ruth understood this. She built her evidence the same way, not for herself, but for the ones who would come after. Every recording sealed in waxcloth inside Hive 7. She knew she wouldn't survive to play them. She built them anyway. I reached into my pocket and felt the MP3 player empty now, its files in evidence lockers and courtroom servers. But there was one file I hadn't played in court. File 43. The last one. Recorded the night before she died. When the Brodifacoum had already done its work, and she knew she would not see another sunrise. I pressed play. Walter. My Walter. If you're hearing this, then you found them. All of it. I knew you would. You were always slower than me, but you never quit. Not once in 40 years. The Queen in 7 is strong. She'll carry the genetics through winter. Don't harvest 7 this year. Let them keep what they've earned. And Walter, don't let this make you bitter. Bitterness is just poison you take voluntarily. You've had enough poison in this family. Plant something new in the South Meadow. Lavender. Maybe. The bees would love lavender. I love you. I loved our life. Every single morning of it. Now go be the beekeeper. That was always enough. I sat until the stars came out. The hives hummed in darkness. 10,000 lives trusting the architecture their keeper had built. In the South Meadow, the ground was already thawing. Come April, I would plant lavender.